No, I'm not now. Hello, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We expected that there was going to be quite a bit of interest in this. But it's even more than we really thought that we're going to be coming along. So thank you very much for coming and joining us. This is a little bit different to some of the webinars that we usually do with the Faculty for Clinical Informatics, where we're talking about a subject and all the knowledge and everything there is established, and we're still trying to like learn more and would have sort of questions and answers. In a way, this is about a really quite exciting development, which is saying, look, we know that there's definitely problems to be solved here, and we're going to try and figure out what way to actually solve them. So the format of the session is a little bit different to some of the other webinars, where we're going to have some short presentations at the start, which will probably take up to about 30 minutes, and then we'll have discussion about what do we want to do. Do we actually want to get a special interest group set up? And I'm thinking, because of the number of people that are here, we definitely do. But what shape would that look like? So whilst Shalane has been saying that we're going to record, the whole thing will be on YouTube, it might only be that our presentations at the start are on YouTube, rather than our discussion about what next steps that we're actually going to take at that stage, whenever we're actually in the cut and thrust of it. So I'm going to introduce the people, and I'm delighted to be able to do this. My name is Anne-Marie Cunningham, and I'm a GP and Vice Chair of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics. I've worked with Sally Lewis for really quite a few years, because we both are GPs actually in the same area in South Wales. So delighted that she's here, and quite a few of my colleagues in Wales have also joined, and Saeed as well. And our other presenter is Neil Sebire from HDRUK. So the background of this, and I think they'll probably tell you a little bit more about this, was HDRUK were doing a session on PROMs, a round table. Sally joined it and said there's lots of technical sort of challenges, interoperability challenges about PROMs. We had a bit of a discussion together afterwards with Saeed as well, and we were like, there was a bit of like, is it special? Are PROMs special? A special interoperability challenge? In a way, there is quite, is it a special technical interoperability challenge or semantic? And that was where we were kind of going from it, trying to work out what are the real challenges, and whose job is it to fix them, and how do we fix them together. So in the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, we've got people who really have interests and know a bit about the semantic, what is the meaning of what we're actually trying to do, why are we trying to do it, the clinical utility, and also quite a lot of knowledge about some of the aspects of the challenges of doing, sorry, the dog is barking, lockdown puppy. So some of the challenges, but actually managing to put it all into place. So that's the background to it all. And we're going to start then, I think, yeah, let me just, our first up is going to be Neil actually giving us some background in this. So Neil, if you want to step up and start going, and then our presenters are going to manage, it's hopefully going to work very seamlessly, and they're going to move through the slides, which are also set up here. So we'll hopefully see some wonderful, yeah.
Right, thank you very much, Anne-Marie. So hopefully someone just give me a shout if you can't see the slides, but it seems to be working okay so far. So my name is Neil Sebire. I'm Professor of Pathology by background. I'm also the Chief Research Information Officer at Great Ormond Street Hospital and Chief Clinical Data Officer for HDRUK. So just to give you a little bit of background to this process, building on what Anne-Marie said, one of the things that we were trying to do, so HDRUK is primarily focused on how we use healthcare data, particularly routine healthcare data, for secondary purposes for research. And for all of us who are involved in this area, we won't be surprised, but many people were quite shocked at how difficult it was to bring together and standardize what you would think would be quite similar types of data. And we saw this a lot with all of the issues around who has COVID, etc. But one of the things that has come up time and time again is around, if we are looking at trying to give a prognostic outcome, or if we're looking at outcomes for other things, how can we start to move beyond what we would typically do, which is survival or some other simple measure, so that we can actually get patient-reported outcomes or experience measures? So we started to think about this and think, well, would anyone be interested in this? And we held essentially an unofficial kind of webinar meeting in HDRUK, and there was a lot of interest. And on the back of that meeting, and for those of you that filled out the pre-meet questionnaires for this, around what are the sort of areas of interest, there are some sort of distinct areas that all overlap and all need sorting out, but have slightly different skill sets and problems. So the first thing is around how do you build this process in so that it's collected in routine care and in a way that is means the same thing regardless of where this was collected. And that's the bit we're going to be focusing on most for this meeting. But of course, there is a whole piece of work around how is the best way of co-designing these PROMs in the first place. So how do you know what you should be collecting? There is the piece around how can we make sure whatever we are doing is optimized as far as we can for research in clinical care. And then there's the fundamental piece of how do you actually do it? So you can have all of these nice ideas, but everyone's using slightly different systems. So how do you implement it? So the intention really of today is to get feedback for everyone on which are the areas that people think are interesting, whether there is value in setting up a special interest group to start to focus on some of these, and in particular maybe to focus on some of those interoperability things. So the first issue fundamentally is, when you're talking about PROMs, what are the things you should be collecting? So what questions do you ask, and what are these things? Now, some of these may be common across conditions, and some will be very condition specific. And there's a whole skill set and a platform of tools about how to come up with what are the correct things. So all around co-design, how you run workshops. This links very much with core outcome sets for studies, etc. So there's a whole piece of work in that area. The focus predominantly, we think, of this group is probably going to be around this bit, which I'll come on to in a minute, which is you now know what you want to be collecting, but how do you represent this in a way that it means the same thing can be shared? So it's all around the standards, and it's standards around you measure, how you record, how you transmit, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that. And then the last part is of equal or more important when you get to that point is how do you implement this? So in practical terms, how are you going to use these tools in a way that is meaningful? So if we sort of focus back just for a minute on this part, so let's assume now you know what you want to be collecting for a given condition. So there are lots of steps that are often currently missing, and certainly there is no overarching standards that encapsulates all of this. So the first thing is around the data elements, if you like. So just specifying what are the things. So if you're going to be talking about pain, is it enough to just use the word pain? Probably not. So when you specify a specific thing around that pain, how do you do it in a way that means the same thing to everyone? So that when this term comes, we're all talking about the same thing. And that then leads into you needing to start to have a data dictionary around these PROMs, so that I would be able to look up and say, well, I'm interested in collecting something around, let's say, nausea in patients with this condition. Has that been done before? What are the classification systems I could be using for nausea, for example? So having these sort of standardized dictionaries, so we don't just for every condition make up entirely new things that by and large should be the same. Because the problem with that is it makes it almost impossible to compare whether the nausea in this scale in this condition is a 7 on that scale is different to a 7 on another scale. Then we need to think, once we've got all of that, how shall we define these? So this is now really around having code sets or classifications. So are these going to be kind of Likert scales from 1 to 10? Are they going to be categories of mild, moderate and severe? And if so, who defines those and how do you define them, etc. Then you need to decide, you've got all of that now, how will you record this information? Is it going to be an integer? Is it going to be a particular drop-down list? How are you going to define the models? So is one PROM a subtype of a different PROM? So how are you going to define all of these things? And then the last part really of the technical piece is, how do you then represent that whole thing in a way that I can send to someone else, either for clinical or for research use, that means the same thing? Now, that could be around things like a FHIR messaging specification for that PROM, etc. And then obviously the final part is then how you test and validate these. So the intention really from today's perspective is to focus really around this area, because these are the kind of things that are the core informatics elements of PROMs, although of course you need to do all of those other parts as well. But from the informatics perspective, it's these things. So really interested in starting to get your views on how we should start doing this. Is there value in setting up this a joint special interest group? Because we're not aware of anywhere that is really focusing on this at the moment. And if so, how should we do it? So hopefully that's just given a bit of a background to what we're doing. I'm going to pass you on to Sally in a minute, who's going to tell you from experience about what are some of the issues when you try and do some of this in real world practice. So Sally, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks,
Neil. You
Neil.
should have control now.
I am taking control. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all virtually. My name's Sally Lewis, and as Anne-Marie said earlier on, I'm a GP by background, but National Clinical Lead for Value-Based and Prudent Healthcare in Wales. And a few years ago, that led me to an interest in PROMs and how we might implement that. So over the last 5 years or so, and now with Saeed as well, trying to implement PROMs for a number of purposes in direct care in Wales, and came across some practical and technical barriers, which is some of the detail that we're going to get into today. So within the Value in Health programme in Wales, this is our vision, which is to improve the healthcare outcomes of people in Wales in a financially sustainable way, and to create a much more data-driven system that seeks to provide timely information to citizens, clinical teams and organisations to inform decision-making. Now that sounds like a simple statement, doesn't it? But it's quite profound when you think about how data needs to be collected, represented and used for different purposes by different people across the whole system. And to make that work, it's really got to work, first of all, for people receiving care and their clinicians first. And if we get that right, we'll get good data sets for secondary purposes later on. And if we don't understand our outcomes, we can't really improve care, which is why I absolutely love this quote from Voltaire, which, although it's 300 years old, still rings true. Doctors pour drugs of which they know little to cure diseases of which they know less into patients of whom they know nothing. And hopefully evidence-based medicine has taken us on a little way, but it's still true to say that we don't know enough about the goals, preferences and outcomes of people receiving care. So what are the consequences of not knowing that? Well, we don't really understand multimorbidity effects. So we generate evidence, don't we, through randomized controlled trials as a gold standard, but very often extrapolate that evidence into the very people who would have been excluded from that trial. So we have a duty, I would say, to understand what happens when we extrapolate that evidence in real life. We need to understand more about patient preference and their context and their status through their healthcare journey. And we can't really understand unwarranted variation in the delivery of care if we don't understand our outcomes and those preferences that people receiving care may have. From an efficiency and effectiveness point of view, we have very often incomplete information or advice for people to make really important decisions about their care, particularly when there are serious trade-offs, for example, between quality of life and length of life. So wouldn't it be great if we could give much more personalised advice for people based on a big database, which can decide based on your characteristics which outcome you're likely to get if you make this choice or that choice. So we need much more information to help people with quite complex shared decision making with their clinical teams. And of course, we have no way of objectively knowing how people are getting on at home. So as a clinician myself, my response to that would be to follow up. And because we are doing so much more to so many more people for very much longer, we're growing huge follow-up caseloads. So we need to be able to figure out a way to communicate with people differently, understand how they're doing, and create new models of care that can cope with that scenario. So when we're thinking about data and digital for value-based healthcare, we need information that's going to therefore help us understand what matters to individuals and have shared goal setting and decision making incorporated into medical notes. We need to understand the outcomes and costs from the left-hand side bubble here so that we can understand unwarranted variation, waste and harm. Use that data for quality improvement and new models of care, and balancing that always with population outcomes and issues of equity, fairness, affordability and sustainability. And as healthcare becomes ever more complex and our interventions become ever more complex, we need data and information to help us navigate our way through those decisions in a transparent way and in partnership with people receiving care. So Neil's explained what PROMs are and why they may be useful. So one of the things that we've learned in Wales is that embedding patient-reported outcome measures in direct care is really, really important if you're going to get a good data set for secondary purposes such as research, for example. And you can see from this illustration of the trajectory of, trigger happy, the trajectory of health status for a person with heart failure over time. You can track that health status with a PROM using defined time points, as you see in the bottom left-hand corner there. And you can see how physical functioning fluctuates over time throughout the course of that journey. So it's not just about assessing the effectiveness of an intervention, but actually it's about, you know, constant status reports along that journey, which is incredibly useful in direct care and for other purposes, as I'll explain now. So one of the challenges that anybody who's been involved with PROMs will know is that it can be very laborious and time consuming if you adopt a sort of traditional approach to collecting PROMs, and often you get quite low response rate. And that's because it's not done in a way that is meaningful for people receiving care or their clinicians. And what this is fundamentally about, or should be, is how we enhance communication and preferably digital communication with people. Because once you have enhanced digital communication, you can hang a bunch of other tasks off that communication, of which PROMs is one, and you will naturally then facilitate data capture as part of the normal process of healthcare. And the other observation I would make then is that an outcome is not just a result of a treatment or other intervention, but it's a milestone along someone's journey. So really quite useful for people to be able to track their own milestones as part of an approach to supported self-management. And the way we might do that is nuanced depending whether we're talking about chronic disease or more episodic care, like, for example, a joint replacement pathway or cataract surgery. So in enhancing that digital communication with patients, you can see you can get appointment management. People can cancel and rebook their appointments, have access to their medical record and test results and share that with whom they choose, flexible access to clinical advice. And as we get more finessed at this, how we feed in perhaps wearable data to help people manage chronic disease. So lots of things can be grouped together with PROMs as part of digitally enabled care. So you can see that this starts to look really interesting in terms of delivering new models of care, but does pose some serious challenges around how we collect data once and use it for multiple purposes and create that healthcare information infrastructure to enable us to do that. And so we need to embed PROMs in clinical pathways, and this is just an example of a typical process map where we follow an individual receiving care and figure out what are the best time points to do this. So this is the practical side of deciding how to do PROMs implementation, is really about process mapping as you would in any other quality improvement intervention in healthcare. But of course, this doesn't cover the technical side, which we'll get onto in a moment. And then just to finish off, so how might we use this information? Well, I've mentioned already at an individual level that it's a useful symptom tracker, can support shared decision making, or even be a trigger as you see a trajectory along a PROM for a key conversation with people receiving care, like advanced care planning or something like that. And then aggregated use of PROMs, many of you will be very familiar with in terms of generating real world information to contribute to our body of knowledge around the impact of an intervention. But one of the really exciting things about it, from my perspective, is that if you aggregate PROM data up, you get a really detailed assessment of unmet need, and that can help us really understand how we meet people's symptom burden at a population level. But in order to do that, we need to sort out the data. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Saeed now to help us describe and think about how we might address some of those challenges. Thanks, Saeed.
Thanks, Sally.
Hold on, Shalane. I don't know what other people are seeing, but I'm seeing someone's Teams window now, not the slides.
Yeah.
Same here.
So Shalane, you might have to take over, stop sharing, take over control, and then Saeed can take control from you. Otherwise, we might see something on someone's messages.
Yes, no problem. Okay, I've taken control.
It was all going so smoothly there.
Sally, are you sharing still? You need to maybe stop.
I lost control on my last slide.
Because somebody's sharing their screen. Right, and that's now I can see the slides. So Saeed, you should be able to take control, I think.
Yeah, I can take control.
Good job.
Let me find my slide.
Can you see it now?
I can. Let me just see if I can move forward. Can you see the slide?
We are there. You've
Yes.
got it.
Well, we got there eventually. Hi, everyone. My name's Shadi. I'm the Assistant Director of Health Informatics and Analytics for Vion Health for NHS Wales. So my background obviously is IT digital. That's where I've spent the best part of 30 plus years, 14 years in the banking finance sector, and the last 16 years in the NHS. So my short presentation, I'm just going to talk about some of the insights into the information and informatic challenges we across NHS Wales are trying to address on our journey, and I'll explain some of the approaches we're taking to address some of those challenges. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on the context because that's Sally and Neil's already touched upon some of these. Two key points here. One is around interoperability, which is a key part of this, which is to ensure we can flow the data seamlessly and in real time from the patient-facing applications into the health boards and into, for us in Value in Health, into the National Collection Repository to support some of the analytics we want to do. And the second area is around data linkages. Again, a key area, but what do I mean? Firstly, it's about being able to link the patient to their completed PROMs questionnaire sets, and then being able to link that piece of information to the correct PROMs longitudinal pathway, linked to the diagram that Sally previously presented. But secondly, it's about ensuring we can identify the relevant anchor points to allow the data linkages to be created between different data sets. So for example, being able to link PROMs data with costing data, audit, reference data, etc. So these are just some of our brief challenges. But if we get it right, then this is what it should look like in terms of flow. And again, this is just a conceptual model. On the left, you've got the patient-facing application the patient uses to complete their PROMs. That data flows into the health board, codified based on our agreed information and data standards, gets consumed within the health board in their local repository, feeds their local clinical applications. And for the relevant PROM questionnaires, and for us, they are defined through what we call DSCNs, which are data standard change notices. So effectively, they're nationally validated and licensed PROMs for use across different health boards and trusts. Those we expect to flow into this central repository, both to feed our national dashboard, so we can support aggregation, comparison and benchmarking, but also to feed that data into the national applications. So for instance, the Welsh Clinical Portal, and build the longitudinal visualizations for healthcare professionals to use. Again, moving away from static PDF documents, which I think has always been a challenge. And again, the bottom diagram is just really a simplified version of the above. And I'll talk about DSCNs and local PROMs data specifications in the next few slides, because they are key parts of what we're trying to address as part of this journey. So how we're addressing some of these challenges. Firstly, around data standards. As I've alluded to, what we're developing is a set of national and local data specifications. So the national data specifications are defined by what we call the DSCNs, the data standard change notices. They are mandates that health boards have to adhere to once those standards are approved by our Welsh Information Standard Board. But notwithstanding that, to allow for local PROMs to be collected and not necessarily flow into the centre, we've also defined, or in the process of defining, a local data specification known as local PROMs data specification. Again, the structure of that is identical to a DSCN. And I'll explain a typical structure of a DSCN in the next few slides. So separate to the PROMs DSCNs, what we've also defined, or in the process of defining, is a metadata. So that's to describe all the data linkages and the supporting information we need to collect. And as Neil alluded to earlier, there's also a data dictionary. In this case, for us, it's a PROMs DSCN data dictionary to ensure we've captured the source of the data in our definitions, but also the terminology to ensure we're all following the same vocabulary when we're referring to PROMs. And the second area is around process standards. So again, one of the slides that Sally presented, she shows you the PROMs pathway, or typical PROMs pathway. So one of the things we're trying to define, or will in the process of defining, is what we call an overarching DSCN for each PROMs pathway, which effectively sets out at what points in that longitudinal pathway we want to collect the PROMs. And again, I'll explain that later, hopefully. And the third area is around interoperability. The there's a lot of work happening in NHS Wales around defining our technical interoperability standards, which will be based on HL7 fire. But notwithstanding that, we still need to do some work around the semantic structures, i.e. what the payload looks like. At the moment, that's one area I believe people are still talking about in terms of how do we package the data to send across the technical interoperability solution, whether that's using fire profiles or open air. That is something we still need to sort of work through and define for our service. But notwithstanding that, getting fire implemented, we know we still got to do some work around defining those policies and guidelines. We know even implementing it and making sure it beds into the service will take time, possibly 1-2 years. But in the meantime, we still need to keep momentum going. So what we've also defined is a compact file format structure, which is effectively a JSON or CSV file structure. And again, that is something we're expecting our PROM providers to implement. So at least we'll get some form of consistency and standards on our journey whilst fire comes along. So in terms of the DSCN contents, for our PROM this is, so typically there's 3 sections in our PROM DSCN document. There's an Appendix A, which isn't shown here, which is around what's changed in the document, so it's more your change history. Appendix B, which you can see on the left here, this illustrations is around the Oxford NEES score, plus any pre and post additional questions, and it really just defines the data structures we're using. But separately, in Appendix C, we also defined the information specifications that sits around the questions. So, but the key point to note here is against each question that we're defining, we have what we call a document reference code. And there is a structure to the makeup of this reference code. And this code becomes important because when a patient completes their questionnaire, we expect this reference code to be tagged to that each of the questions and to map to their response. That then flows into the health board, gets codified and stored within the health board, but also then goes into the national repository, and that code becomes a key item we use to know what question was asked and what the response was, so the value set. So in terms of the structure of the package DSCNs, so in this illustration, in the case of the knee arthroplasty data set, there's actually 6 DSCNs that constitute that data set. So we've got the core question, which is the core questions questionnaire, should I say, which is OKS, and then we have the 3 supporting generic questionnaires that form part of that question set, which is the WPAI, EQ5D, and About You. But separately to that, we have an overarching DSCN. If you remember earlier, I talked about a DSCN pathway. That is what that document is. So the pathway in there defines what is the collection schedule, longitudinal collection schedule for knee arthroplasty. So if the health board was using this particular set, it gives them the full picture in terms of what that looks like. And this just really breaks that down in a bit more detail in terms of the DSCNs itself. So in case of the OKS DSCN, in there, you'll have your core questions, any additional pre-agreed pre-op questions, and any additional pre-ops, so post-op questions. And in case of our PROMs metadata, there's a whole structure of terms of data items that constitute that structure. So really, that's just really giving you a flavour in terms of some of the things we're trying to address. We're not there yet. As I said, these DSCNs we are in the process of defining. We have something like 38 national PROM questionnaires that we're codifying into DSCNs, and we're aiming to have that completed in the next month or 2. obviously what we need to still do after that is then work out what solution we use in terms of the semantic layer, in terms of mapping this into a structure in the longer term. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you for that update and for covering so much there. We've had some interesting comments started coming up here in the sidebar in the chat. We've got 20 minutes left now to try and see how do we pull sort of all of this together. It is a big challenge, isn't it? It's like we're sort of saying, let's try and think about how we standardise. We already know the interoperability challenges of trying to standardise and exchange information that's recorded by clinicians. And in a way, this is kind of the other side of it, where you're saying, let's try and think about how the things that we want to get recorded by the patients is standardised as well. Another big, massive area. Neil picked up that an old friend of ours, well, I shouldn't say, a very experienced friend of ours, Tim Benson, is on the call, who's kind of written the book on interoperability. And I was just going to go to Tim first of all to say, Tim, could you give us just like a bit of a background? Because Tim always manages to cut to the chase about these things. So what's your view about where we're at with this at the moment?
Right, I think that health and PROMs is a complicated area, like everything in healthcare, and it's got multiple components to it. There's been some debate about the semantic side of it, and that is, if you don't get that right, you can forget about interoperability. If you don't get things coded right, and again, you know, we need to have standard codes such as LOINC codes or SNOMED codes. Inventing our own codes, which is done and has to be done if people don't use the other ones, but we do need to use the standard international codes because PROMs is exactly the same anywhere in the world. So the semantics is a big issue. Then there's a big distinction between generic measures and condition-specific measures. I mean, Oxford knee score is a condition-specific measure, and people interested in orthopedics are unlikely to be very interested in mental health and vice versa. I mean, there are exceptions, but it'd be nicer if there were rather more. But certainly the generic side has been very strongly developed by the pharmaceutical industry, who've only needed PROMs for the purposes of controlled trials, etc., to get drugs licensed. In terms of fire, we need to decide what we're going to use. My view is that fire release 4 is the only one worth considering. Anyone who tries to do anything with earlier versions or earlier versions is just largely obsolete, and the rest of the world's going to R4, so why shouldn't we? And later versions, well, they'll come along sometime, but most of them will be backward compatible to R4 because America in particular is going to R4. But we need profiles. There's no point in trying to use the standard FAR resources because they are all things to all men and will cover even very complicated things such as where the computer chooses the next question to ask and things like that. So you actually want simple ones. There's issues related to data collection, results reporting. The bit that Sally described, which I think is very important, is the use cases, how in fact it will be used, whether you will use, whether in fact electronic patient records will trigger the issue of collecting PROMs, and whether the results will be fed back to clinicians are again things which are difficult. The whole question of information governance raises all sorts of interesting questions, which will, which will stop any project in its tracks very simply, unless it's dealt with. Those are just a few of the minor complications.
Maybe we need a new organisation rather than a new special interest group, but yeah, it's like, yeah, where are we starting? And that was some of the comments from Angie on the side saying, look, we know that there's sort of the right people on this call, but how do we actually all manage to work together, and where would you start? And we're not going to figure out all that today. We're not even aiming, but we're trying to see by the end of it if we've got some idea about the next steps. So Sally, like if you could come back and...
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and hi Tim, really lovely to see you again as well. So one of the things that struck me while we were on the HDRUK call before Christmas was that the extent to which PROMs for multiple purposes is really becoming quite a mainstream activity, and people are wanting these multiple use cases. So there's a sort of urgency around us working together on this and describing possible solutions, but not in isolation. So I think we need to do it with suppliers, and I know we've got some suppliers on the call today as well, because clearly we need to do it in partnership with suppliers if this is going to work across that whole ecosystem, really, to support patient care, isn't it? So that's a big question for me about how we move forward.
Can I ask Neil? Oh, sorry, Nicholas. Nicholas has got his hand up. Yeah, Nicholas Price-Jones. Did you want to make a comment?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Nicholas Price-Jones. So I work for an organisation called Open Medical, which is currently based in London, but we're an NHS clinician-led organisation. So all of our directors are, funny enough, trauma and orthopaedic surgeons. And I was going to ask the question about whether you were considering external organisations outside of NHS Wales, but Sally very nicely answered that question as well. But I was interested in listening to Mr. Benson as well when he's describing about FIRE and the networks, information governance, etc. And we've actually developed a platform with PROMs that we've launched in NHS England, which actually covers all of this, uses all the PROMs templates, etc. So my question would be whether there would be an interest in some of the key stakeholders actually seeing a demonstration of what we've done and how interoperable it is. We use the file set network, etc. So it's a ready-made solution already.
Yeah, Nicholas, can I ask, when you did that work and NHS England commissioned you to do it, did they?
No. Well, this is the thing. We actually...
Because my question was going to be, what standards did you develop that to?
So in terms of standards, what do you mean now?
Well, for you were saying about the interoperability. Were you given, did anybody say, oh, there's the thing, we want to use this, but it has to meet this standard because we need...
Absolutely. So we've in terms of interoperability, I mean, we've connected to the Cerner systems, the Epic systems, local healthcare systems. So because of the we do all of our own programming, so this is not off the shelf sort of programming. Whatever needs to be done, whether it's a mesh system, for instance, we can work with any system. The only thing that's ever slowed us down in terms of interoperability is the time and resources of the local IT teams. Which is what we recognize, and we try and take on as much work as possible. But I think the key thing behind this is we are an NHS-led organisation. We're not a fully commercial body. Sure. So when we're doing this work, this is not, shall we say, in the millions of pounds region. This is in the tens of thousands of pounds region, because it's there's a lot more to it in terms of the mission that we're trying to achieve.
Sure, but you just from what you've sort of, if I'm going to summarize, you've built integrations with different EHRs, but those have probably been like a point-to-point kind of. It's not that there's been a standard that you've been using and everybody's, and we know that because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I just wanted to make 100% sure.
No, absolutely, and it's we move beyond that as well. So what our key platform that we've started actually developing is a trauma and orthopedic platform called Etrauma, and this is for patient pathways. So it leads the patient pathways all the way from the emergency department through the trauma and orthopedic department through to rehabilitation. And PROMs was born out of that as well, because PROMs and PREMs we do actually. Sure. So this is the full end-to-end patient pathway and getting the outcomes and experience measures from this. And it's all been built very intuitively. So I've actually, funny enough, I had an operation with NHS Wales because I'm based in Cardiff. I had an operation with NHS Wales a couple of years ago, and I had to fill out the PROMs questionnaire, and it's drop-down menus, move to the next page sort of scenario, in that sort of way, whereas ours is a single page selection boxes rather than drop-down menus. It's a lot more intuitive and easier to use. But I'd be happy to demonstrate that at some point.
Sure, I think, I suppose, we know, I mean, it's on your platform, sounds great. We know that there are many platforms for this. The issue is that there are many platforms, and how do we actually manage to do, is it all going to be point-to-point kind of integrations, and you'll go in there and everybody has to do it, and okay, you've got this, or is there a possibility of moving towards standard? It's in this kind of more greenfield area kind of emerging. Is there a possibility that we can move towards standardization, and who would we need to have involved in actually doing this? We know that NHSX side, like Irina Bolchevsky, has started as like their lead for standards and interoperability. Does an organisation like NHSX have a part to play in this? Other organisations with the semantic bit, PRSB and things like that, where is that sitting? So that's, I think, what if we were trying to kind of get to, is like, who are the people that we could do, and how can we contribute? I can see somebody else's hand up.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing before? I don't want to suck up all the time. But the other thing Mr. Benson actually mentioned was surrounding SNOMED CT, for instance, and that's what we use along with our natural AI algorithm to code all data. So all of our data on our platform is coded, and it would be the same with PROMs then. So that'll be me. I'll let other people talk.
That's definitely a good thing.
Thank you.
I can see Neil's hand is up, and I think there might be somebody else whose hand is up. So Neil, I'll let you come back.
Well, if there's someone else, they can go first, because I've spoken already.
I'll just say if there's anybody else that's got their hand up, because Canton.
Hi there. Hi, my name is Canton. I'm a consultant orthopedic surgeon in Birmingham. So I'm sort of part of the National PROMs network, and obviously very interested in this. And I know a few people on the call, and I've just managed to jump in between my operative cases. So I mean, I think what we're talking about here is trying to, have a platform-based approach, isn't it? So you've got the software developers developing the software, but the data store being central and being standardized. So, for example, OpenAir is a really good example of a CDR, where your platform's been read from that CDR, which is an open standard. So I think we probably need to be getting towards that type of kind of technology to actually really get not just interoperability, but that seamless sort of data transfer between systems and things. So I know that's quite a big ask, but I think that's kind of where we should probably be going, and then the software developers can actually develop the software rather than developing proprietary systems or file systems, which is essentially a translational layer rather than a sort of a granular layer with such as OpenEHR. But I think
Yeah, thank you, Canton. I can see Ian McNichol's hand up as well. I suppose today I'm just going to say I don't think we're going to have not that it is a war between FHIR and OpenAir, or between platform and messaging, but I don't think that we're probably not going to get to that point today. But Ian, what would you like to?
I was going to say the opposite. I was going to say actually in this space, I think one of the things we can do is to do a lot of the data modeling in OpenAir, because it does what Neil was explaining at the start. It does what Said was showing in terms of the DSCNs. So we do that. If you've got an OpenAir system, it will work directly in an OpenAir system. That's fine. But it can also be used just to get clinical, get the clinical requirements sorted out. And then could be turned into FHIR profiles really easily.
Fast.
I think automatically. We can't do that for the OpenAir to FHIR transition is not that but for these things it is, because by and large they're going to questionnaires. And so this is a place where we can actually make the best of both worlds. It is not a competition. It's a big old space, and many of the questions about alignment of questions that Neil was talking about, the technical side of this is relatively easy. I think we've got all the tools to do that with good, and as an OpenAir community, and Canton's one of it, we're piling through doing ortho PROMs, ophthalmology PROMs, cancer PROMs is coming up. So we got to do it for our community anyway. I'd be very happy to work with other people.
Okay. So I think for us, kind of, we've got a lot of interest in that. We've got 5 minutes left. I've got a lot of interest here in the room, in people in this. We haven't tried to sort of say what, let's get down to the remit. If we have a special interest group, what would be the remit of, or what would we be trying to do? Who should we have in? How would we work that? The Faculty of Clinical Informatics, this was an interesting, because it started off as being joint. It's the first time we've had the concept of actually a joint SIG between HDRUK and with us in the faculty. Within the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, we've got people who are non-clinicians as well as associates, who are absolutely free to take part, because we have to work through some things like what structure would we like the group to be, what the boundaries and things of it are. And I think maybe the first thing might be to just contact the people in their evaluation we've already put up there. Shillian, have we asked a question there about whether people would like to be involved further?
Yeah, we have.
And I think if we use that as our first step of sort of saying, look, you've heard what we're talking about here. This is a big problem. Well, that we're going to have to limit this down a bit, but we're going to be trying to be proactive and get things done. So if you're interested in continuing on further, then let us know about that whenever you're filling in the feedback form. Have that as your way of getting back to us and letting us know. Neil, is any other comment you'd like?
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think there's a couple of things that I could see coming from this that could be reasonably quick deliverables, just in terms of just who's doing what in this space, what are what are the open air teams doing, what are the fire teams doing, what are different groups doing. So at least we can start to sort of landscape map that. That would be a relatively straightforward thing, and also from the researcher side as well. And then the other thing that I think we could do pretty quickly as a group is to say what we're not doing.
Yes.
Which would be, I think, Johnny, you mentioned in the comment that absolutely this group, whatever this group would be, would not decide what the PROM should be. That would be over to some of the disease-specific groups. But it would almost be that when you have these groups to decide what's the special PROM you need for whatever it happens to be in rheumatoid arthritis, they would then be able to potentially consult with this group to say, well, these are what we want. How might you do this? Has something similar been done for another disease that you've already got a standard or whatever? So I can see some ways of doing it without trying to suddenly say we're going to solve all these problems. It would be to start in that middle bit. And then obviously the other side of that is, as you mentioned, Sally, is around, even if you do all of that, you've got to engage not just the frontline staff, but the sort of suppliers, etc., about how do you get these things out. And I think someone else mentioned, my chat's gone, I'm afraid, but someone else mentioned in the chat about what you might do about algorithms that calculate things from PROMs or give you a score, or because again, those can be standardized and modularized, and you can then present them back in nice ways to patients or clinicians if you can get the core data elements. So I think it's so I think there's lots of things that are tractable, given that we're not going to solve this, but I think there are bits we could start doing. So I think it's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got 1 minute. I'm going to ask if you think that there is interest or in a special SIG going on about this. Can you kind of like do a little bit of give us a clap? Yay, we've definitely got some. That's brilliant. Well, I'm delighted with this. I think it's been really interesting. We've got lots of great people here. We know there's a lot going on. This was a bit about starting to get, identifying the people that are working in it, identifying what the work needs to be done, and then we'll be following up with you.